I remember a time, or rather a stretch of time, so long past that even the weight of its memory almost seems too great to bear. In those dim and troubled days of medieval life, I came into existence as an executioner, a role that has haunted my every waking thought and even my dreams. My tale is not one of valor or heroic deeds, but rather of a slow, inevitable decline of the soul, if you will, into a life that in every conceivable way ensured that I would never truly survive the harsh realities of that era. I have long come to understand that my fate, as grim and dismal as it was, rested on the fact that I belonged to a trade revered by few and reviled by many, and that to carry the knife of death as my trade in those times was to invite isolation, disgrace, and a constant, relentless burden on one's soul that made survival nearly impossible. I was born into a world that was as cruel in its simplicity as it was relentless in its customs. My earliest recollections are of a modest home on the outskirts of a shabby little town, where my father was a humble craftsman and my mother a woman of gentle spirit, with a disposition as soft as the warm woolen cloth that shielded us from the chill nights. Yet from an early age, I sensed that fate was not kind to me. Contrary to the natural desires of a child to be loved or protected, I always seemed to be singled out for burdens that even a child could scarcely comprehend. My destiny was not woven from the same fabric as that of my siblings, who gradually matured into the trades of merchants, farmers, and later, even a fledgling scholar. No, mine was distinct and darker, a destiny that would lead me to a place where life and death were measured by the stroke of a heavy axe or the swing of a sword, and where the executioner was forever cast aside as both necessary and abhorrent. I was apprenticed at a young age to a man notorious for his unyielding nature and grim professionalism, a master executioner whose reputation stretched far and wide, even beyond the borders of our small region. My master's methods were methodical and spare, his every movement steeped in a ritualistic precision that he passed on to me. In those early days, I believed that I was learning a craft, a trade that, while grotesque in its nature, was nonetheless a respectable part of the fabric of medieval society. Yet as I grew older and the full implications of my calling unfurled before me, I began to see that the role was more of a curse than a blessing. I was doomed not only by the deeds I carried out, but by the knowledge that I could never truly be among the living. I was forever marked as an outcast, an indispensable tool wielded by the authorities to maintain order, yet simultaneously despised for the very death I delivered. Throughout those long, weary years of service, I found solace in routine and the slow march of time. My days would often start before the sun could even hope to crest the horizon. I recall the chill before dawn, when the town was draped in a persistent fog that blurred the familiar shapes of cottages and cobbled lanes. I would walk those streets with a heavy heart, knowing that behind many doors there were lives filled with hope and love, lives I was destined to interrupt with declarations of fate. I could see the wary glances cast in my direction, the hurried steps of commoners avoiding me as though I were a harbinger of some unspeakable doom. Such moments, like the mundane flicker of an oil lamp on a cold winter's night, were both a comfort in their ordinariness and a reminder of all that I had lost, the ability to lead even the faintest semblance of a normal life. Every execution was a study in the paradox of man's nature. There were times when I found the act so mechanistic and devoid of personal flair, break time 500 milliseconds, that I began to wonder if the ceremonies were nothing more than public rituals, a kind of grim theater performed for the sake of order and spectacle. I recall one execution on an overcast autumn day, the air thick with the damp chill of impending winter. I was tasked with carrying out the sentence on a man accused of crimes against the crown, a man whose eyes, in the trembling twilight, had held within them a sorrow that was almost palpable. I remember the sound of the crowd, a murmur of disdain, and in some rare instances, a tinge of pity, mixing together into a hushed cacophony that accompanied the final moments of his life. And as I executed my duty, my own hands hovered uncertainly over the instrument of death, trembling as if they were aware that in that one act I was sealing not only his fate, but also sealing an irrevocable part of my own soul. In that moment, the weight of the task, the inevitability of sorrow, was a cloak too heavy to bear. I soon learned that survival in medieval times was not measured strictly by the length of one's life, but by the delicate balancing act between maintaining one's inner humanity and fulfilling the demands of society's harsh and unforgiving codes. I saw learned men and wise clergy desperately clinging to fragile threads of hope, while those who dealt in the currency of blood and fear, people like me, were entangled in a sinister counterpoint, doomed to be remembered only for the finality of their actions, rather than the intricacies of their character. I often reflect on the irony that as an executioner, I carried the essence of life's transition in my very hands, yet I was permanently estranged from the life that flowed so vibrantly in others. While noblemen and peasants alike could retire to their beds after a day of labor and correspondence, I was condemned to wander the twilight of my existence with little more than the scarred remembrances of each life I had extinguished. I must admit that there were moments of unexpected laughter amid the perpetual gloom of my occupation. I recall a day when a particularly obstinate rooster, having escaped its coop, found its way to the courtyard where I was preparing for an impending execution. The creature, with a ridiculous sense of bravado, strutted around me as though it were a battle-hardened knight rather than the domestic fowl it truly was. For a short while, I was distracted from the inevitable sorrow of my duties and laughed softly at the absurdity of it all. It was dirty work, and yet in that brief encounter, I could almost imagine that the natural world itself was conspiring to alleviate the weight of my burdens, even if for a moment. I'd later be told by a fellow craftsman that the memory of that defiant bird was enough, in its own peculiar way, to remind us all that even in the darkest hours, there existed some spark of vitality and an almost rebellious humor. Such moments, fleeting as they were, served as a quiet counterpoint to the unyielding nature of my responsibilities. It is said that the mark of an executioner is not solely in the precision of one's task, but in the accumulation of memories that gnaw at the very core of one's being. I have known, more intimately than most ever will, the dark underbelly of human despair. In countless moments of sorrow and regret, I have stood in the forecourt of justice, wielding the instruments of death like a weary harbinger of fate, and I have seen the raw anguish in the eyes of those condemned. The faces of my victims often remain imprinted upon my mind, each pair of eyes a silent indictment of the cruelty that was their end. In my quieter moments, alone in the dim glow of a lonesome candle, I would let my thoughts drift over the faces of those I had sent to the afterlife. Their collective gaze, a mosaic of regret, innocence, and sometimes even defiant resignation, often made me question not solely the morality of my work, but the very society that demanded it. I was never immune to the pangs of guilt, even though I had been taught that I was merely the instrument of a higher authority. It became increasingly clear that in a medieval world where death was both a spectacle and a necessity, the role of the executioner was one permanently cursed with isolation. There was a profound loneliness that accompanied each swift swing of the hammer or drop of the axe, a loneliness born not only of physical separation from one's fellow man, but also of an endless internal solitude whereby the weight of each life taken rendered one forever estranged from the natural joys that life might have offered. In contemplating my own survival, if survival could truly be measured in such a barren environment, I find that the reasons are manifold. My craft precluded any possibility of blending into the common milieu. I was always a figure set apart by my occupation, marked by a permanence that no other could claim. The very air around me seemed to carry a hint of finality, an odor of inevitability that clung perpetually to my skin and clothes. The crudely painted signs on tavern walls, the fearful looks in market squares, and even the whispered names carried by the wind reminded me daily that I, an executioner, was a pariah in the eyes of both the mighty and the meek. No matter how many times fate was deferred, or how many lives I touched, I remained that outcast, a man to whom no warm hearth or gentle embrace could ever extend its solace. I recall wandering the misty lanes after the grim business of the day was done, feeling an indescribable emptiness that gnawed steadily at the fringes of my mind. Winter's chill seemed to seep into my bones, while the fleeting warmth of summer offered no reprieve from the perpetual shadow of despair. It was as if I were condemned to exist on the boundary between life and death, neither fully belonging to the realm of the living nor granted the peace of oblivion. I remember a particular winter in which the harshness of the cold bore a curious similarity to the internal frost that had taken residence in my soul. A series of executions had taken place in rapid succession, and the chill of each event seemed to accumulate like layers of ice upon my heart. The village elders murmur about the cruelty of the times as if it were a passing storm, but for those of us living the executioner's cursed life, the very air was saturated with the bitter residue of sorrow. Even as the natural world continued in its ceaseless cycles, the sparrow building its nest, the farmer preparing his meager scraps for the long slumber of winter, I found no comfort in nature's indifference. Instead, I was plagued by an overwhelming sense of futility, that no matter how delicately the instruments of death were wielded, each swing, each measured act, was but a reminder that survival in the most fundamental sense was beyond my grasp. I was, and would always remain, a necessary aberration in a world that had little room for a man dragged so deeply into the morass of human mortality. In the absence of a true home or kinship, I turned inward to find solace in the minutiae of daily life, a habit that, if nothing else, offered a small reprieve from the ceaseless churn of despair. I became almost unwittingly a student of the ordinary. I learned the cadence of the river that meandered beyond the vale of our town, whose slow, deliberate flow reminded me of the passage of time, relentless and indifferent. I took comfort in the simple pleasure of mending my own garments with a needle and thread, watching the fabric slowly come together, stitch by careful stitch, while my thoughts wandered in the quiet hum of solitude. I recalled with a slight, ironic smile how I would sometimes measure the distance between my modest dwelling and the gallows, with the same scrupulous care with which I measured a condemned man's last moments, a habit that, in itself, became a metaphor for the irrevocable measure of my own life. While others found meaning in the immortal words of poets, or the vibrant teachings of scholars, my solace came from observing the delicate interplay of mundane details, the unremarkable perfection of each small, tangible moment. And yet, even these seemingly trivial pursuits were not sufficient to erase the grim specter of my occupation from my existence. At times I would sit quietly in a dim corner of my modest abode, my thoughts on the countless faces I had seen and the lives I had ended. It was then that I would ponder if any true survival was even possible for someone like me, someone whose every deed was steeped in the finality of death. I came to understand that life in medieval times was, for all its vibrant celebrations and furtive moments of joy, ultimately as fragile and ephemeral as a candle in a storm. For the common folk, Each day presented itself as a fresh canvas on which hope could be painted anew, despite the harsh strokes of reality. But for me, the canvas was perpetually marred by the indelible ink of sorrow and regret. There were days, particularly in the languid hours after a somber execution, when the simple act of breathing felt like a transgression, each inhalation a reminder of the moral cost of my chosen path. I must confess that in the midst of my long and ceaseless burden, there were rare, almost absurd interludes when I felt a kinship with the natural world. I vividly recall one summer afternoon when, after a particularly taxing week of business at the gallows, I took a leisurely walk through a sun-dappled orchard at the edge of the town. The warm light filtered through the leaves of ancient trees, their gnarled branches reaching out as though in benediction. As I ambled along the gravel path, I noticed a small puddle reflecting the blue sky overhead. In that moment, I found myself absorbed by the simple, almost miraculous detail of the light dancing on water, a quiet reminder that the world, for all its grim utterances, still harbored beauty in its tiniest expressions. For a brief interlude, the burden of my existence was lifted, replaced by the sensation of simply being, of existing in harmony with a nature that was impartial and in its own quiet way forgiving. However, even that transient peace was but a fragile interlude in a life otherwise defined by the inevitability of loss and despair. I often muse on the paradox of my existence and wonder if, in some twisted sense, the role of an executioner was devised precisely to ensure that one could not ever fully partake in the communal joys that so defined a life in medieval times. As I observed the everyday camaraderie between townsfolk during festivals and feasts, I noted with a quiet melancholy that my presence was always a silent void at the table, a chasm that no convivial laughter or shared toast could ever hope to bridge. I attended such gatherings infrequently, always as an outsider, for even in moments of communal celebration, my identity was never concealed. The villagers would nod in silent acknowledgement, their eyes flickering with a mixture of respect for the dignity of the moment and a deep-seated revulsion at what I represented. I recall one such evening when a local bard recited a ballad extolling the virtues of community and togetherness, all the while casting occasional sidelong glances in my direction. In that instance, the very act of celebration seemed tainted by the ever-present reality of my trade, as if my participation in such merriment would somehow invalidate the purity of the communal experience. Instead, I found myself an eternal observer, walked out of a fellowship that blossomed in the hearts of others, yet remained forever closed to me. Throughout my long years, I recorded my thoughts in a small leather-bound journal, a habit that provided both a tangible link to my own humanity and a testament to the slow, inexorable passage of time. In quiet moments by candlelight, I detailed the minutiae of my existence, the measured toll of the bell before each execution, the precise weight and balance of the instruments of my office, and even the different textures of cloth and wood that I encountered in my daily toils. It was in these scribbled reflections that I sought to stitch together an understanding of who I was and why survival in such a brutal epoch was, for someone like me, an almost unattainable treasure. I wrote often about the irony of my situation, how the very hands that ended lives were the same that sometimes sought the gentle caress of a loved one's embrace, or the tender touch of a well-formed child's hand reaching out in trust. I wrote of small joys, like the way the first bloom of spring hinted at renewal, even as darkness lingered behind the smile of every waking dawn. And yet, between those lines, there was also the persistent echo of a truth I could not deny. that my trade, as necessary as it was in the eyes of the ruling powers, condemned me to a solitude that was as absolute as it was bitter. There were days when the simple act of maintenance, sharpening the heavy blade that I would soon wield, became a ritual, an almost meditative practice that allowed me to feel a fleeting semblance of control in an otherwise uncontrollable life. The cold metal under my fingers was a constant reminder that each instrument of death was as unyielding as the fate I had chosen. In the quiet moments of twilight, when the day's grim labors had finally ceased, I often found myself seated by the modest hearth in my sparse dwelling, the flames dancing in a gentle rhythm that contrasted so starkly with the discord of my thoughts. I would stare into the fire, tracing its meandering trails with my eyes, and muse upon the cyclical nature of life and death. The flickering embers seemed to whisper humble truths about the impermanence of all things, the ephemeral nature of beauty, the transitory shimmer of joy, and the ceaseless march of time that spared no one, not even an executioner. It was during such hours that I realized the most painful irony of all, that the very role I fulfilled, with its strict adherence to duty and a grim sense of order, ultimately left me forever estranged from the simple, unencumbered act of truly living. In the depths of winter, when the nights stretched long and cold, I would sometimes lie awake in the darkness, listening to the quiet creaks and sighs of a building burdened with memories as heavy as my own. I wondered whether the solitude I endured was a punishment deserved, or simply an inevitable consequence of a destiny steeped in unrelenting sorrow. I recall one particularly frigid night when, as a biting wind swept through the narrow streets and rattled the windows of my humble abode, I found myself pondering the eternal deliberations of morality. Outside, the world seemed frozen in time, each gust of wind a whispered reminder of nature's indifference, while inside, my mind churned with questions that even the passage of endless icy hours could not answer. There was a quiet resignation to my thoughts, or recognition that the path I trod was one that could never lead to redemption, nor truly allow me the luxury of survival in the fullest sense of the word. Every breath, every heartbeat felt measured in sorrow, like a final accounting of a life that was doomed from its very inception. I do not claim to have found any neat resolution to these musings, nor did I ever expect that the relentless demands of my occupation would ever yield to a semblance of normalcy. As the seasons cycled inevitably from one into the next, my existence became a quiet litany of grim obligation and solitary introspection. I began to recognize that survival, in any authentic sense, was a luxury reserved for those untainted by the corrosive touch of death. The role of an executioner was not one that allowed for the gentle unfolding of life's many unexpected joys, the warm shared laughter of a community, the tender embrace of a family gathered at a humble feast, or the simple pleasure of watching a child's eyes light up at the marvels of the world. Instead, I was destined to traverse a path of perpetual estrangement, my every step the reminder that death, once invited into one's very soul, casts an inextinguishable shadow over all that remains. As I travel now, within the depths of memory, through the long corridors of time that seem to stretch endlessly before me, I see clearly the patterns of my existence etched into the very fabric of the medieval world. It was a time when life was balanced precariously on a knife's edge, and where the roles of those who directly engaged with that edge, executioners among them, were condemned to a sort of existential exile. Society saw us as instruments of necessary cruelty, each act of execution a grim service performed for the sake of order. And yet in return for that service, we were denied the simple mercies that might allow our spirits to truly flourish. I am reminded of the many evenings I spent in silent reflection, watching the stars emerge in a cold, unfeeling sky, where even the infinite expanse of the heavens seemed indifferent to the petty sufferings and inconsequential joys of mortal life. In those moments, I was struck by the inevitability of my fate, a fate that seemed to be written in the very stars above, a script of isolation and despair that rendered any hope of true survival a distant, almost laughable notion. It was not only the social rejection that made survival in those times a near impossible dream, but also the ceaseless, creeping decay of one's own spirit. I became well acquainted with the idea that every human soul, no matter how burdened, possessed a flicker of hope, a small, defiant light that sought to shine even in the darkest of places. Yet as an executioner, that spark was often smothered by the relentless task of extinguishing the lives of others. I have often wondered if there existed, somewhere deep within the recesses of my being, a last vestige of what it meant to live in a manner untainted by the merciless hand of fate. Perhaps it was a memory of innocence from an earlier, happier time, a time when I had not yet been forced to choose between the measured justice of a heavy drop and the fragile, uncertain persistence of human decency. But such thoughts, delicate as they were invariably overwhelmed by the monstrous inevitability of my duty. I found that the deeper I delved into the dark recesses of my own conscience, the more I realized that I was not merely an executioner by trade, but a sort of walking testament to the cruelty of fate, a living embodiment of a system so ingestively flawed that even those bound to serve it were left with little chance of true redemption. There were in those long years moments when I attempted to imagine a different life, a life that might have been lived in another time, under gentler circumstances. I would picture myself as a simple wanderer, perhaps a humble tailor or even a clerk, living in a modest town where the clamor of daily commerce drowned out the somber toll of the executioner's bell. In such reveries, the burdens of my forgiven yet unforgiven past seemed lighter, as if the simple joys of everyday existence might wash away the perpetual stain of tragedy that clung so stubbornly to my soul. I remember once passing by a quiet field in the late afternoon, the grasses swaying in a soft breeze, the scene so innocuous and yet so achingly different from the grim settings of my usual day. For a fleeting moment, I fancied that I might have been one of them, a simple man enjoying a sunset, unburdened by the horrors of death heaped upon his shoulders. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, melting the splendor of the day into the encroaching night, that fragile hope was swiftly swallowed by the ever-looming specter of my destiny. No matter how earnestly I wished for a life untainted by violence and despair, I remained irrevocably bound to the role that had been thrust upon me, a role that in every sense precluded any hope of true survival in a world where death was a regular visitor at the door. The slow monotony of fate, coupled with the weight of each life taken, eventually left me with the inescapable realization that my own survival was not measured in the number of years I might amass, but rather in the moments of warmth, however fleeting, that defied the dark legacy of my station. I began to treasure the rare instances of kindness, a shared glance, a half-smile from a downtrodden stranger, or even the bemused chuckle of a wayward child marveling at the peculiar figure I cut amid the throng of daily market life. These small acts, trivial as they might have seemed to others, were imbued with a deep, resonant meaning for me. They were reminders that, despite being forever shunned by the very society I served, there remained in the hearts of some a glimmer of recognition for the basic humanity that we all shared. It was in such moments that I dared to believe, even if only for a heartbeat, that perhaps I was not entirely lost to the darkness, a notion as delicate and transient as the flutter of a moth's wings in the night air. I have spent many a long hour pondering the paradox of my own existence, sitting by the quiet glow of a dying fire as I allowed my thoughts to drift between the realms of memory and regret. I have questioned whether the role of an executioner is one in which the true measure of survival is ever attainable, or if it is only the yet more cruel certainty that my destiny was sealed the moment I first took up the heavy instruments of my trade. It became increasingly evident that the very act of delivering death was as corrosive to the spirit as the slow decay wrought by time. With every measured swing of the blade, a piece of my long-suppressed humanity was chipped away, leaving behind a shell of a man who was at once indispensable and utterly alone. And so I trudged onward, day after day, burdened by the inexorable truth that my survival in medieval times was always condemned by the nature of my own calling. Looking back now, with the benefit of many years and countless silent moments spent in self-reflection, I comprehend more clearly the reasons why I, as an executioner, would not have survived had I been forced to compete in the realm of common men. It was not merely the physical dangers, disease, starvation, or the ever-present threat of violence from those who despised me, that contributed to my isolation. Rather, it was the profound, soul-deep realization that my identity was inseparable from the sorrow I wrought, and that each life ended by my hand was like a tiny, irretrievable loss from a treasure trove of living hope. Executioner's path is one marked by solitude, the kind that festers in the heart and leaves behind an unfillable chasm where future joys might have taken root. Every public execution was a spectacle, a reminder to the masses that order was maintained at the price of human dignity. But for me, each spectacle was a personal trial, an unending sequence of painful reckonings with the very nature of life and death. In that brutal theater, I was cast not as a hero, but as a perpetual outsider. Condemned to wander in a realm of perpetual mourning, always looking in from the outside upon the warm glow of a community that would never include me. I have here laid before you the slow, measured account of a life lived at the intersection of necessity and desolation, a life that by its very nature could never truly flourish in the gentle light of normalcy. As I bring this part of my narrative to a close, I do so with the quiet knowledge that my tale, though long and burdened with sorrow, is also a small testament to the endurance of a spirit, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. In the twilight of my memory, I carry with me not only the weight of loss and despair, but also a gentle understanding of the most human of experiences. That survival, in its truest sense, is measured not in the number of years one endures, but in the delicate moments of connection and the rare sparks of hope that defy the endless gloom. I have come to accept that my role, protracted and unyielding, was destined to remain an eternal reminder of a time when the harsh demands of life and death were inextricably bound together. And so I close this chapter with a quiet resignation, a slow, droll acknowledgement that in the medieval tapestry of existence, the executioner, burdened by both his craft and the isolation it brings, was never meant to truly survive the relentless passage of time, except perhaps as a wistful memory caught between the weary sighs of those who still believe in the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest of nights. I remember, as if it were a misty evening in a forgotten chapter of my life, the days when I held the somber title of executioner in medieval times. It is a curious recollection, woven between threads of melancholy routine and the gentle cadence of time passing slowly, much like the measured toll of a distant bell in a sleepy village at dawn. I have often mused about why I, with my unassuming nature and contemplative soul, would not have thrived in that harsh era. As I recline and trace the patterns of those memories, I allow the slow drift of my thoughts to invite you, dear listener, into a story that meanders with a soft humor and a profusion of mundane details, as though each moment were explicitly designed to lull the mind into a tranquil reverie. In those bygone days, I found myself tasked with duties that weighed more heavily on my spirit than on my body. The role of executioner was a position marked by solemn inevitability, its very name conjuring images of grim contrivances and nightmarish inefficiencies. Yet it was an occupation that unfolded with a peculiar blend of ritualistic precision and the gentle banality of everyday labor. I recall the cool mornings when I would rise before the crowing of roosters, and while the rest of the town slumbered, I would begin my routine. The ritual of oiling my tools and ensuring that the executioner's axe was honed to a mirror-like edge was an act that took on a meditative quality. Every swing of the mallet against the whetstone resonated like the steady beat of a heart, echoing through empty corridors of my closed-off consciousness. I often reflect on the irony of being an executioner, a title that by any modern standard seems as misguided and impractical as a sailor trying to navigate a starless sky. I would have been an assortment of contradictions, gentle and introspective in my private moments, yet visible to an unyielding public as a harbinger of death. In the slow rhythm of the medieval existence, I often wondered whether I would have survived the internal disquiet that came with the necessity of my occupation. There was no escape from the persistent murmur of regret that tracking the final moments of a life imparts. Every day, as I walked the cobbled paths that led to the imposing wooden gallows, I questioned whether I could bear the weight of my duty, and whether, in a world ruled by superstition and brutality, a man such as I could ever find solace. The schedule of my days was punctuated by the simple yet somber tasks of preparation and execution. I would often pause to admire the interplay of sunlight and shadow on the cold stone walls of the executioner's quarters. A small, cramped room that was both a sanctuary and a prison. The scene was so mundane in its repetition, yet each detail carried the weight of an unspoken truth. The polished scabbard for my ceremonial dagger, the worn leather strap that held the axe there, and even the chipped glint of the iron handle told a story of decades of service. It is amusing, in hindsight, to recall how methodical and almost reverent I became about every detail. I treated each tool as if it were an extension of my very being, and soon I realized that each scratch and blemish on the tools were like notes in a long-forgotten lullaby, reminding me of how time, relentlessly gentle yet inexorable, had shaped my existence. The lives of those who came before me were steeped in ritual and symbolism, and I, too, wove such rituals into the fabrics of my daily routine. In moments of solitude, when twilight filtered softly through the narrow window of the stone chamber, I would sit and reflect on the peculiar juxtaposition of my everyday existence against the backdrop of my grim profession. I would think of the humble farmers who tilled the fields by day, and the noble warriors who clashed in battle under the banner of honor. Between these extremes stood my own life, a series of measured, almost poetic actions that brought about the finality of mortal existence. I carried out my duty with an odd blend of compassion and detached inevitability, as though I were a melancholic instrument in an orchestra playing a symphony of sorrow. The routine was so thoroughly ingrained that I found myself humming in a cadence that matched the tick of the ancient clock in the town square, a rhythm that reminded me of the relentless passage of time. I must confess, though, that the peculiar nature of my role often felt like a slow-moving paradox. On the one hand, I was burdened with a duty that demanded a relentless stoicism, and on the other, the very mechanism of carrying out death provided a strange corridor for introspection. I would sit in the shadow of the execution block, contemplating the ordinary minutiae of life, such as the soft patter of rain on the stone roof, or the gentle creak of wooden beams under the weight of history. The repetitive tasks, such as preparing the noose or adjusting the gleam of a well-worn axe, served as a canvas on which my thoughts painted abstract sketches of mortality and melancholy. The mundane details of my role, which might seem trivial to an onlooker, were in fact the quiet pulse of my existence. Each moment, a brushstroke in a painting that chronicled the subtle art of living with one foot invariably in the realm of the departed. I often found humor in the absurdities of my time. There were moments, albeit rare and fleeting, when the disconnect between the gravity of my responsibilities and the triviality of everyday life propelled a reluctant smile to my lips. I recall one particular afternoon during the spring thaw, when the sun timidly peeked through heavy clouds, illuminating the dew-dappled grass outside the village square. A local baker, renowned for his crusty breads and colorful anecdotes, had approached me with a basket of freshly baked loaves, insisting that even an executioner must occasionally enjoy the simple pleasure of a good slice of bread. His earnest eyes and hopeful words, filtered through the lens of medieval propriety, were both touching and absurd in their sincerity. It was as if he believed that my profession might one day be softened by the aroma of yeast and a well-kneaded dough. In that moment, I felt a deep, if transient, connection to the idea that perhaps there was more to life than the relentless drumbeat of grim duty, a sentiment that still lingers as a warm ember in my memory. With the passing days, I could not help but notice how the medieval world was as steeped in rituals and allegorical meaning as it was in superstition. Every corner of the town, every whispered legend, and every turning of the seasons all resonated with the same quiet inevitability that underscored my daily life. I learned that the weather, too, seemed to conspire in a manner befitting a slow, medieval poem. There were warm summers where the air was thick with the scent of hay and the distant murmurs of a busy marketplace, and harsh winters when each step on the frosty cobblestones was accompanied by a crunch that reminded one of life's impermanence. In such moments of natural reflection, I would consider whether a man such as I, engaged in such a delicate dance with death, could ever find a semblance of normality, or indeed, a chance to simply be. My heart, constantly oscillating between the calm of routine and the disquiet of moral quandaries, was a repository for both the weight of historical responsibility and the lightness of mundane amusement. There were many evenings when the entire village would gather, sometimes by necessity, sometimes out of a grim curiosity, to witness the final act of an individual's life. As I prepared for these somber ceremonies, I would try to imbue each action with a measured reverence and a sense of inevitable finality, as if every movement were a carefully choreographed step in a ritual dance. Regardless of the personal cost, I knew that I must perform my duty with the precision of a metronome, my actions forming the bedrock of medieval justice, however flawed and arbitrary it might be. On these occasions, I was forced to confront the duality of my own nature, the part that wished to retreat into the comforting obscurity of ordinary life, and the part that recognized the inexorable pull of destiny. In the quiet pauses between the final words spoken over the condemned, I dreaded the thought that my own life, if subjected to the same harsh scrutiny of medieval society, might have been treated with the same unyielding indifference. In reflecting on those times, I have come to realize that survival in the medieval period required more than mere physical resilience. It demanded a spirit that could dance on the tightrope of existential paradox. The notion of being an executioner in such a world was fraught with inherent contradictions. The very act of carrying out death so methodically was a testament to both human ingenuity and human frailty. I would often find myself wondering whether I, a humble man, tasked with this grisly responsibility, could have carved out even a modest existence without becoming consumed by the weight of my own conscience? Would I have been able to retain the gentleness that defined my inner world, or would the unrelenting pressure of continuous moral dissonance have eventually transformed me into something less compassionate? As I carefully adjusted the buckle on my leather belt and ensured that no stain had dared to mar its surface, I knew that my personal struggle was as nuanced and perplexing as the labyrinthine corridors of a medieval fortress. I was not alone in these contemplations. There were quiet moments of intimacy shared only between myself and the silent echoes of the ancient corridors I roamed, when I would recall conversations with other men who, like me, bore the yoke of fate with a solemn dignity. A fellow tradesman, a miller by trade, once confided in me that the weight of his daily grind was, in many ways, as burdensome as the executioner's duty. He spoke of the mundane trials of balancing the grindstone, the ceaseless hum of the water wheel in the village stream, and the infinite cycle of seasons that rendered time both a friend and a foe. Listening to his unhurried yet profound musings, I was struck by how the everyday challenges of life could, in their own slow and inexorable manner, mirror the heavy specter of death. The universe, it seemed, had a certain irony in store for men like us. The very nature of survival was often a delicate interplay between admiration for life's simple pleasures and the inevitability of endings. My own days revolved around a pattern of quiet, measured repetition. The early morning hours were spent in a kind of isolated solitude as I meticulously prepared my modest tools, a process that I now recognize as both an act of foresight and a ritual steeped in the symbolism of transition. Each tool, whether it was the finely balanced axe that gleamed with an almost apologetic sheen, or the small, unassuming knife that lay hidden in a worn leather pouch, was inspected with painstaking care. There was a certain dignity in understanding that these instruments, however grim in their purpose, were also the very implements of a larger narrative. A narrative that in its entirety held both a somber inevitability and a quiet absurdity. It is amusing to recall how, on more than one occasion, I found myself lost in thought as I observed the subtle interplay of light and shadow along the grain of the wooden handle, as if the wood itself were trying to tell a gentle, forgotten story of its past life as part of a forest now long diminished by time. At times, I would wonder if perhaps I was not entirely suited for the role I had been given. In the quiet hours before dawn, the solitary moments when I walked the meandering paths leading from my dwelling to the town square, a persistent thought nagged at me. Could a man with such tender inclinations truly sustain himself in a time when every day was a battle against the relentless tide of public judgment and violence? I recall one particularly crisp winter morning when the skies were a muddled mix of gray and blue, and the cold air carried fragments of distant conversations. As I trudged along the frost-kissed path, my breath a delicate plume in the chilly air, I could not escape the feeling that the seemingly eternal darkness of medieval justice would eventually draw me into its depths. The slow, almost imperceptible doubling of my footsteps echoed amidst the quiet lanes, a gentle reminder that each step carried the weight of a destiny I had never chosen, yet could not discard. In these moments, the tiny absurdities of life, like the shivering of a stray feather caught in a winter breeze, or the slow drift of a melting icicle from an ancient wall, served to underscore the deep uncertainty that lay at the heart of my existence. Evenings, when the weight of the day slowly transitioned into a calm introspection, were perhaps the times when the paradox of my life was at its most evident. After all was done, once the gallows had been dismantled and the crowd had dispersed, I would retreat to the solitude of a humble cottage on the outskirts of the village. There, by the light of a modest hearth, I would record in a leather-bound journal the minutiae of my day. The entries were simple, noting the precise temperature of the mead, as read by the slight condensation on the glass, and the exact angle of the moon as it waxed and waned across the night sky. It was during these moments, as I scribbled down observations that bordered on the clinical, that I began to treasure the mundane in a way that transcended the boundaries of my profession. The careful documentation of the day's events, no matter how trivial they might have seemed, became my solace, a quiet testament to the fact that even a man burdened with such a grim title could find beauty in the small details of living. I must admit that the court of public opinion in medieval times was a most fickle institution. The people held firm to the ancient customs, and while some bestowed upon me a sense of grudging respect for the necessity of my role, others viewed me as an outcast, a remnant of a system that was both feared and reviled. In the public squares and among the narrow alleys, whispers of disdain and irony circulated like a persistent, low hum. Even as I walked with measured steps amidst the narrow lanes, I was not immune to the sideways glances of those who saw in me a reminder of the harsher facets of medieval justice. Yet, much like the gentle rustling of leaves in a forgotten orchard, these murmurs, while not entirely absent, were often drowned out by the rhythmic cadence of daily, life-affirming routines. And in that gentle interplay of judgment and tacit understanding lay a bittersweet reminder that the fabric of medieval society was woven from threads both impenetrable and delicately frayed. As time passed, indeed in a manner so slow that it almost seemed to be the stuff of fables, I found that the challenges of existing in such an era became increasingly intricate. I began to wonder if my very soul was ill-fitted for the relentless violence that marked the medieval landscape. There were days when I would sit quietly by a small stream that wound its way through the outskirts of the village, watching the gentle ripple of water over smooth, time-polished stones. In the soft murmur of the stream, I heard a lullaby that reminded me of the cyclical nature of all things: birth, life, death, and perhaps rebirth. These peaceful reveries, in which the simplicity of nature unfurled its unhurried beauty, only deepened my inner conflict. For how could one who spent so much time on the precipice of finality ever embrace the calm continuity of everyday existence? That very tension between the ruthless demands of duty and the gentle pull of a quieter, humbler life was perhaps the reason why I, in retrospect, understand that I would scarcely survive the unyielding pressures of medieval life. There were opportunities for diversion, even amidst the monotony of my existence. The medieval world was not entirely bereft of a sense of humor, however understated and hidden it might have been. I recall, with a small, amused smile, a particular encounter with an eccentric apothecary, a rotund man with an almost comical preoccupation with the precise balance of herbs in his concoctions. Every day at the market, he would extol the virtues of his latest mixtures, a potion here, an elixir there, always insisting that even the lowliest soul was entitled to a measure of his herbal wisdom. Despite the gravity inherent in my occupation, I found his exuberant claims both entertaining and oddly uplifting. His insistence that a well-brewed tea could cure the maladies born of a weary heart, or that a proper tincture of lavender could soothe the deepest sorrows, served as a gentle reminder that even in the darkest of times there existed a glimmer of absurd cheerfulness. In these moments, I would allow my thoughts to stray towards the lighter side of existence, dated as it might have been, and marvel at the incongruity of life itself. A life so filled with both sorrow and serendipitous humor, so plagued by inevitable endings, and yet, somehow, so resiliently marked by small, intermittent joys. Even as I delve into these memories, I am aware that the medieval era was a time when societal expectations and rigid codes of conduct were imposed with an almost unforgiving zeal. In such a world, conformity was prized above all else, and any deviation from the established norms risked severe consequences. I often reflect that if I had been thrust even further into the labyrinth of that social order, I might have found myself strangled by the expectations of what a man of my station should be. Expressions of inner turmoil or overt vulnerability were luxuries seldom afforded to someone in my line of work. The very title of executioner was a shackle, a chain that not only bound me to a course of action, but also forced me to wear a guise of indifference, regardless of the whirlwind of emotions churning silently within. In my quieter reflections, I would imagine a life where such masks were unnecessary, where a man could openly lament the nature of his existence, and where the gentle cadence of a remorseful heart might be listened to with compassion rather than with fear or disdain. Yet, as the years melted away like the delicate frost on a window pane at dawn, the rhythm of my days remained stubbornly anchored to the routines of duty. Each morning was a meditation on the unavoidable obligations of life, and each evening a quiet testament to the weight of experiences accumulated incrementally over time. I began to appreciate the simple, almost poetic aspects of these routines. The way the morning frost glistened on the blades of grass outside the executioner's quarters, the slow emergence of birdsong as the sun rose in muted splendor, and even the rhythmic creaking of the wooden door as I stepped out into a world that was both familiar and profoundly indifferent, were ingrained in my memory. These small scenes of everyday beauty served as gentle counterpoints to the more somber acts of my official duty. In my heart, I held the conviction that in a world where survival was contingent upon an unyielding adherence to social convention and a ceaseless commitment to duty, my inner self, soft, reflective, and profoundly human, might one day shatter under the pressure of relentless expectation. I pondered in quiet solitude the myriad ways in which the medieval landscape was as harsh as it was magnificently detailed. The stone walls of the narrow lanes, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, the delicate tracery of sunlight and shadow filtering through stained glass in grand cathedrals, the distant echoes of a folk tune drifting from the marketplace. Each of these elements coalesced into a mosaic of existence that was both unforgiving and inexpressibly intricate. It is in this interplay of rugged physicality and fragile beauty that I found a profound metaphor for the inner workings of my own life. The medieval era, with all its grandeur and grim fatalism, could easily have swallowed a man who lacked both resolve and tenderness. I understood then that my very nature, frail as it might be in the face of unyielding cruelty, was destined to clash with a world that prized the stern and the callous above all else. The simple truth was that survival demanded more than just the ability to carry out one's duties. It required an unrelenting fortitude of spirit, a capacity to endure outbursts of cruelty with a hardened heart, and a willingness to relinquish the quieter, more human parts of oneself in favor of a relentless front. In retrospect, while I am grateful for the wisdom that those years imparted, I cannot help but feel that my gentle spirit would have been an anomaly in the broader tapestry of medieval society. Each day, as I performed my solemn duty, I was constantly reminded of my own vulnerability, a vulnerability that manifested in the solitary hours of reflection, in the hesitant tremor of my hand as I prepared for the inevitable, and in the hushed moments of self-doubt that would creep upon me unexpectedly. I vividly remember one particular autumn day when the wind carried the bittersweet scent of fallen leaves and the faint murmur of grief mingled with the rustle of dry branches. Standing by the gallows, I felt as though the very fabric of existence were unraveling, exposing the tender underbelly of life that so few were permitted to see. It was in these moments, a gentle intertwining of despair and wonder, that I realized with no small measure of sorrow that my very soul was not engineered for the brutal rigor of medieval justice. For instance, the relentless demands of public duty left little room for the nurturing of personal dreams or small indulgences. I occasionally entertained the notion of retiring to a quiet life in a distant valley, imagining days when the only sound would be the soft murmur of wind through the trees and the distant call of a nightingale. Yet even the prospect of such serenity seemed to elude my grasp, constrained as it was by the unyielding nature of the responsibilities that had become so much a part of me. Medieval society, with its rigid structures and uncompromising traditions, left little space for a man whose heart was prone to gentle introspection. One might say that my very existence was a kind of covert rebellion against the norms of my time, a quiet refusal to let the more tender parts of my humanity be entirely subsumed by the callous demands of my role. It is a thought that both saddens and slightly amuses me in equal measure, for the irony is as plain as the polished metal of my axe. Here I was, a tool of death, harboring within me the fragile dreams of a simple, peaceful life. On a particularly memorable evening, I found myself wandering along the quiet margins of a moonlit forest, the soft glow of the moon casting hazy shapes upon the ground. The forest was alive with a gentle symphony, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl perched high on an ancient oak, and the distant murmur of a burbling brook. In that hushed wilderness, I allowed myself to linger in the beauty of the moment, a rare interlude in which the demands and burdens of my official duties receded into a distant echo. I paused to gather a small bouquet of wildflowers, a modest token of beauty in a world otherwise dominated by the starkness of death and duty. As I inhaled the faint, mingled sense of dew and earth, I began to reconcile with the idea that perhaps I was not entirely out of place in that vast, indifferent medieval world. Even so, the simple act of gathering those delicate blooms served as a poignant reminder that a man of my station, with his inherently somber role, would always be at odds with a world that celebrated life with such unbridled, if sometimes misguided, exuberance. There were moments, too, when the little ironies of life in those times seemed almost absurdly poetic. I once encountered a traveling minstrel, a wiry fellow in a threadbare tunic, who fancied himself both a poet and a sage. He would travel from town to town, serenading the gathering crowds with tales of valor, love, and the ephemeral nature of time. One evening, as I accompanied the procession to a nearby village, the minstrel began to recite verses that spoke of a melancholy executioner who carried his burden with a strange sort of grace. The verses, though simple and unadorned, struck a deep chord within me, yet also brought a wry smile to my lips, given the absurdity of my situation. The minstrel's words, echoing under the vast canopy of a starlit sky, captured the incongruity of a life spent at the crossroads of cruelty and compassion. A life that, despite its somber purpose, still possessed a hint of gentle humor and wistful grace. In the quiet of my reflective hours, I often pondered the delicate interplay between destiny and free will, wondering whether the roles we inherit define us completely, or if there remains within the hidden corridors of our hearts the possibility of transformation. For me, the title of executioner was both a curse and a calling, a symbol of the tremendous weight of societal expectations and the inescapable duty that bound my fate. The constant cycle of preparations, the silent countdown to the moment when destiny would be sealed with a single stroke, and the endless procession of faces that sought closure in the finality that I provided. All of these converged to create a life marked by a slow, relentless tension. And yet, amidst that tension, there resided a part of me that clung to the beauty of small, unremarkable details. The soft resonance of church bells in the distance, the laconic tick of a carved wooden clock in the village hall, the subtle shifts in the scent of the air as seasons turned. Each of these simple phenomena was a quiet reaffirmation that life was not solely defined by grandiose acts of finality, but also by the minutiae that, in their quiet persistence, wove the rich tapestry of human experience. I have long since come to understand that survival, true survival, in a time as unforgiving as the medieval age, required not merely the execution of one's duty, but the ceaseless cultivation of inner fortitude, resilience, and an unyielding commitment to the gentler truths of existence. If I were to be confronted with the prospect of enduring that era once more, I suspect that my gentle nature, so easily swayed by the beauty of a dewdrop or the soft murmur of a distant brook, would be a liability. The shifting tides of public sentiment, the ruthless edicts of authority, and the sheer, unremitting cruelty of everyday life would likely have overwhelmed the quiet sanctuary of my inner world, leaving behind nothing but a hollow reflection of the man I once was. And perhaps, in that incongruity, lay the reason why I, with all my tender inclinations and an almost absurd collection of mundane musings, would have struggled to persist. Even now, with the calm comfort of hindsight and the solace derived from memories etched in the twilight of time, I allow myself to smile at the irony of it all, a gentle, knowing smile that acknowledges the sheer improbability of my survival in that brutal epoch. For survival demands more than the capacity to endure physical hardships. It demands a hardness of spirit that, in my case, was inexorably tempered by empathy and a fondness for the soft miracles of everyday life. I still recall the countless hours spent in quiet contemplation, pondering whether the sharp edge of my axe, and indeed that very edge of fate, was an allegory for the boundaries that separate our desires from our destinies. In the silence of my recollections, I can almost hear the soft hum of the grinding stone and the whisper of a sigh carried on a cool wind through the centuries. As I now retire into the comforting realms of reflective reminiscence, I am filled with a profound sense of gratitude for the simplicity inherent in the moments that once defined my days. The memory of a well-worn path, the sight of a properly hung lantern in a humble doorway, the deliberate care with which I maintained my tools, all these details speak to the quiet dignity of a life lived on the edge of inevitability. I am reminded, too, of the odd humor that often interlaced itself with my daily duties, a humor as understated as the nearly imperceptible smile shared between two strangers in passing. In a world otherwise dominated by the formalities of life and death, these small moments of levity were as precious as they were rare, serving as gentle lights in the dark corridors of my memories. In the end, I came to realize that the very nature of my existence as an executioner was a delicate balancing act between the stark finality of death and the tender intricacy of life. Slow, measured steps along the cobbled streets, the careful polish of my axe handle, and the soft cadence of my reflections were not merely a series of decisions made under the duress of duty. Rather, they were the small, unassuming acts of resistance against a world that demanded a hardness of character I could not wholly embody. I have learned that survival in the medieval age required a thoroughgoing pragmatism, a willingness to cast aside the indulgences of sentiment in favor of an austere, unyielding composure. Alas, my own nature was too infused with the delicate appreciation of beauty and the small joys of existence, rendering me ill-equipped to thrive in such a ruthless environment. Now, as I dwell on these recollections with the gentle cadence of a long, unhurried monologue, I hold dear the humblest of truths, that even in a time when the shadow of death loomed large, there remained pockets of unexpected grace, a grace found in the glistening dew at dawn, the warm glow of a hearth on a bitter winter night, and the simple act of noticing the world's quiet wonders. I often imagine a scenario where, had I been merely a humble craftsman rather than an executor of fate, the days would have unfolded with a considerably different texture. Perhaps I would have spent my mornings carving intricate designs into small pieces of wood, my afternoons engaged in quiet conversation with neighbors over the soft clink of pottery in well-worn kitchens, and my evenings enjoying the gentle cacophony of nature and human laughter mingling under a starlit sky. In contrast, my life was marked by the relentless gravity of an office that required no less than the extraction of the final accord from a life's symphony. As I continue to traverse the corridors of memory, I invite you to imagine, too, the enduring beauty found in the gentle rituals of a bygone era. For every harsh decree, there was an overlooked moment of softness, a child's smile in the twilight, the slow, deliberate art of setting a table for supper, long after the rush of official business had subsided, or the quiet exchange of a courteous nod between individuals bound by a mutual understanding of life's fragile impermanence. It is these details, often considered inconsequential by the untrained eye, that form the backbone of what I now appreciate as the true essence of a life: mundane, gentle, tender, and ultimately human. I share these memories with a calm wistfulness, knowing that the very act of recollection transforms the harsh chords of the past into the softer melodies of reminiscence. My life as an executioner in medieval times, with its relentless duties and its unyielding demands, is now only a series of impressions, each one as delicate as the brushstroke of an artist, painting in shades of gray and quiet blue. In the long, measured hours of recollection, I find that the reason I would not have survived those times was that such a life would have forced my inherently reflective nature into a cage of pragmatism, stripping away the gentle facets that, in the end, made me who I was. So, dear listener, as you nestle into the comfort of your own evening and allow sleep to gently overtake your thoughts, consider the idea that life, no matter how harsh or indifferent it may seem, is full of small, unassuming moments of genuine beauty. In my own history, every clang of metal, every soft sigh of the wind through an ancient alleyway, and every fleeting smile in the marketplace offers a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit. I now understand that survival in a time as ruthless as the medieval age would have taken not just a steely resolve, but also an abandonment of the tender introspections that made life, in its most serene form, worth living. As the night deepens and the world outside falls into a slow, abiding silence, I am reminded that time itself is a gentle river, carrying with it both the bitter and the sweet. The rituals of the past, no matter how grim they might appear when seen in hindsight, were interwoven with the soft cadence of human hope, moments of tenderness, and even occasionally, a light-hearted laugh in the face of overwhelming odds. I find solace in the thought that even someone like me, an executioner by fate and circumstance, could appreciate the quiet wonders that, in the end, define a life more beautifully than any harsh decree ever could. In the slow drift of recollection, I see now that the medieval world, with all its grand ceremonies and relentless severity, did not have room for men who treasured the ineffable grace of a soft sunset or the delicate murmur of a distant brook. I imagine sometimes with a gentle humor that warms my heart, that in a world dominated by swift judgments and unyielding demands, my quiet moments of reflection would have been viewed as frailties rather than as the very essence of a more profound human experience. And so I find that in the careful memory of those times, I am both a relic and a rebel, one who embraced, perhaps too tenderly, the ephemeral beauty of every passing day. Now, as I let these memories fade into the soft backdrop of my thoughts, I consider that the ultimate lesson of my life as an executioner in the medieval age is that survival requires not only the strength to carry out one's duties, but also the wisdom to recognize the fleeting, almost inconsequential beauty of a well-lived moment. Perhaps that is why, in retrospect, I believe I would have struggled to thrive in a world unyielding to the gentle art of reflection, one where the very act of pausing to admire the muted brilliance of a star or the quiet fortitude of a single autumn leaf might have been deemed a luxury I could not afford. The gentle humor that once surfaced in the most unlikely of circumstances was a silent protest against the relentless despair that pervaded my duties. A reminder that amidst an era defined by its harsh necessity, there remained small, almost imperceptible sparks of grace. And so, as I bring these recollections to a slow and reflective close, I leave you with the quiet assurance that every life, no matter how burdened by duty or fate, is composed of countless delicate details. Each observation, each softly delivered note of humor, each meticulous attention to the mundane elements of existence is a step toward understanding that even in the darkest corners of history, gentle light can be found. The medieval world, with all its imposing structures and unyielding edicts, never allowed. I recall evenings beneath a heavy, foggy sky, where the moon's pale glow fell upon the cobblestone streets of a small medieval town. I was the executioner, a man whose trade, as odd as it may sound now in the quiet of modernity, involved heavy responsibilities that seemed to press down on my soul like the weight of lead. In those times, I quickly learned that surviving as an executioner was far more challenging than many would assume. I spent countless nights pondering why I, with my nervous tics and mild temperament, was ill-suited for a life in a medieval world that prized brutality and rough humor. I suppose that I would not have survived for many reasons, some as mundane as the constant unpleasant odors that filled the air, and others so profound they tugged at the edges of my identity. There was always a lingering irony in the fact that while I was charged with sending souls to their final rest, I was, in truth, hardly capable of enduring the harsher aspects of life. I remember how the early morning fog would settle in the narrow alleyways, and even in that silence, the memories of the previous night's duties haunted my every step. I often found a strange solace in the rhythmic clanking of my tools as I prepared for another day's work. My axe, a heavy iron instrument, gleamed dully in the light of the flickering torches, each spark reminiscent of the last breath of a condemned soul. The mechanical routine of oiling the gears of the heavy wooden door that separated the town square from the execution yard was something I carried out with an almost meditative focus. Of course, my mind would wander to the absurdity of it all, a man tasked with meting out death, yet longing for the chance to enjoy quiet afternoons reading in the monastery's abandoned library. Had I known then that my gentle inclinations could be my undoing, perhaps I might have sought another path altogether. Instead, each day's labor reminded me that survival in medieval society was not just about physical strength or mastery of one's craft, but also about maintaining a delicate balance between duty and genuinely feeling remorse for the human cost of such a role. The town, with its rickety wooden buildings and sodden cobblestone paths, felt at once like a stage for a grim play, and a refuge from the unpredictable whims of fate. I remember walking along its outskirts, where the soft murmur of a distant brook provided a contrasting lullaby to the clamor of market life. The smell of freshly baked bread mingled with the tang of freshly cut timber, and occasionally the unmistakable odor of blood, a scent that seemed to cling to my clothes and linger in the air long after the day's grim business had ended. I would sometimes pause by an old stone wall, brushing my fingertips over the cool surfaces as if to confirm that life still existed beyond the boundaries of inevitable death. At these moments, I felt caught between two worlds, one of grim duty and another of wistful dreams, where perhaps I could escape the role that fate had forced upon me. There were many small details in my daily routine that, in retrospect, amount to evidence of why I would not have survived for long in those medieval days. I remember the way the old clock in the town square, with its heavy pendulum and creaking gears, chimed mournfully at each hour. Its sounds, echoing off the stone walls, seemed to count down the moments of every condemned man's final life and my own slow drift into despair. It was nothing dramatic, really, just a mechanical sound that I came to associate with finality. Yet over time, I became painfully aware that such inevitability is the constant companion of life in a land where ruthlessness and compassion walk hand in hand. It was precisely this mixture of relentless duty and unexpected self-pity that underscored my every movement, making me painfully aware that this was not a life meant for someone of my temperament. I can still vividly recall one particularly long winter, where the biting cold seeped into one's bones, and even at dawn, the first hints of frost gave away the chill of impending despair. I walked along the procession route with a heavy heart and numb fingers, feeling the weight of my responsibilities as each step echoed on the snow-covered ground. Every breath was a white puff in the air, and with each exhale I felt as though I were releasing part of my compassion into the freezing ether. I often wondered how a man bound to such somber tasks could not only survive, but maintain any semblance of inner peace. My musings were punctuated by the dull, insistent thud of my boot against the frosted earth, a sound so ordinary, yet imbued with the gravity of countless life-ending moments. This melancholic rhythm reminded me continuously that the work of an executioner was less about executing a job and more about the slow erosion of one's spirit. In the long, drawn-out afternoons after a particularly taxing execution, I would retreat to a dim, barely furnished chamber in the back of a modest inn. I understand that the notion of an inn being my retreat might sound odd to modern sensibilities, but back then, a room with a sturdy door and a crackling fire was a treasure beyond measure. There, amidst the comforting, simple clutter of a wooden table and a small vase of wildflowers, a modest attempt at brightening the drab space, I allowed myself moments of quiet introspection. In those hours of solitude, I would wonder about the nature of justice and mercy, and my mind would wander to the strange duality of a life spent meting out punishment while longing for innocence. Of course, my idle thoughts were not entirely profound. Some nights, I found myself amused by rather trivial reflections, like whether the cream in my cup of brew might have been sourced from a cow with equally sluggish manners. It was in these small, seemingly insignificant details that I found both comfort and a reminder of just how ill-prepared I was for the capricious realities of medieval life. Despite the outward appearance of a duty-bound professional, I secretly harbored small dreams that lay far beyond the grim business of executions. I often fancied that one could trade the macabre tools of the trade for something oddly melodic, like the simple pleasure of playing a lute in the town square, serenading passers-by with ballads of love and loss. It may sound like a trick of the light-hearted imagination, a silly daydream born out of the monotony of a relentless routine, but it was a reminder that even a man such as I, burdened by grim destiny, could still imagine a gentler existence. I would watch children playing near the bustling market stalls, and think that, if I were granted the liberty to choose, I might have spent my days in the carefree pursuit of simple joys, rather than the heavy, grim business of ending lives. Yet, this inner contradiction made me even more painfully aware of the harshness of the world I inhabited. In truth, each execution was a somber reminder of the delicate line between life and death that existed in every human encounter. I remember the faces of the condemned, their eyes reflecting a mixture of defiance, despair, and sometimes even a resigned acceptance of fate. Their expressions would often haunt my dreams, not out of a desire for vengeance or guilt, but rather as quiet reminders that I was a mere instrument in a larger, indifferent machine of justice. This realization, so profound in its quiet cruelty, somehow chipped away at the enthusiasm needed to endure further in such a turbulent time. I could not help but wonder if by some twist of fate I might vanish from the rigid order of medieval life, drifting off like one of the many forgotten souls of the past. And yet, every morning, I found myself forced back into a cycle of routine and grim necessity, each day a slow march toward an inevitable exhaustion of the spirit. There were days when the weight of expectation from the local lords and the populace seemed almost unbearable. The magistrates would frequently remind me, through stern glances and hushed admonishments, that my role was as indispensable as the town's great bell that tolled at each solemn interval. It was a duty enshrined in ancient rituals and age-old precedents. Yet I often felt as if I were a miscast actor in a play written in a language whose meanings I no longer fully understood. The irony was not lost on me. A man whose profession required an unparalleled resolve found himself sinking into an inner melancholy that no amount of stout ale or hearty meal could alleviate. I would retreat to my modest lodging in the dead of night, listening to the distant lament of a lonely, the soft strains of his song melding with the sounds of my own weary heartbeat. In that quiet interplay of sorrow and music, I slowly came to terms with the harsh fact that in this world of relentless finality, my own survival was a fragile and elusive concept. A particularly illustrative memory comes to mind, one that I recount with a mixture of quiet amusement and rueful nostalgia. It was on a bright autumn day, when the leaves danced around the gutters of the town, like small, fluttering reminders of nature's inevitable transformation. I had just finished the grim business of the day, and for once found myself with only idle time on my hands. I took a slow, meandering walk along the outskirts of the village, careful to avoid the gazes of those who might judge me for seeking solace away from the stage of public executions. As I wandered, my thoughts drifted to the absurdity of my circumstance, an executioner whose heart was filled with an inexplicable longing for a simpler existence. At one point, I encountered a group of local children playing with a makeshift hoop and stick, their laughter echoing through the crisp air. I paused to observe their playful antics, marveling at how their innocent joy contrasted so starkly with my own dark coming to terms with fate. One scruffy lad, noticing my lurching gait and somber expression, boldly trotted over and offered me a bright apple. The child's earnest smile and the simple gift of a piece of nature's bounty managed, however briefly, to remind me that even in a life as burdened as mine, small acts of kindness and unexpected mirth had a way of softening the relentless hardness of existence. I accepted the apple with a gentle smile, a gesture that, though incongruous with my station, symbolized a quiet rebellion against the inevitability of my role. There is little to say about the mundane details of an executioner's daily wardrobe, yet even these trivialities underscore why one might falter in the perilous medieval milieu. My attire, a patchwork of dark fabrics and resilient leather, was chosen less for comfort than for its foreboding impression. The heavy boots that carried me through rain-soaked streets also served as unwanted reminders of the days I trod the path to the scaffold. I recall the many afternoons spent meticulously mending these garments, each stitch a laborious act that fused necessity with a wistful longing for the gentler close of a world that did not revolve around the cessation of life. Such repairs, conducted in the lonely hours of dusk when the world was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, were marked by the simple pleasures of tactile engagement with thread and cloth. In those quiet moments, the rhythmic motion of sewing needle into fabric elicited a surprising sense of calm, a meditative reprieve from the inevitability of the morning's dread. And yet, even in that humble act, I was constantly reminded that the life of an executioner, no matter how methodically one approached it, was an existence marred by inherent contradictions. It is fair to say that my relationships with the townsfolk were as laden with quiet irony as the rest of my life. Although I maintained a respectful distance, I was not entirely shunned. There were moments when the local apothecary, a kindly soul with a penchant for herbal remedies, would offer me a small sachet of fragrant lavender, claiming it kept nightmares at bay. I would accept these offerings with a grateful nod, my mind abuzz with reflections on the nature of compassion in a world where death was so customary a visitor. Despite my grim vocation, I found solace in such gestures, for they represented an unspoken understanding that even the most hardened roles were touched by humanity's softer instincts. Later, as I sat near the inn's modest hearth, the aroma of burning wood blending with the lingering scent of lavender, I would muse over the peculiar connectivity of life, a tapestry woven with threads both fine and grotesque. With every sip of tepid ale and every turn of conversation, I became increasingly aware that my survival depended not merely on physical prowess or steadfast duty, but on a delicate web of small kindnesses and unexpected humor. The marketplace, vibrant with the clamor of barter and the soft hum of everyday life, presented another arena where my status was paradoxically both acknowledged and subtly ridiculed. I recall one particular market day when a well-dressed merchant, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of one accustomed to refined tastes, commented lightly on my undignified appearance. His remark, delivered with a conspiratorial wink to a few onlookers, seemed to underscore how out of place I must have appeared. A somber man caught in a role that demanded not only the execution of law, but also the sacrifice of any semblance of normalcy. The exchange left me with a bittersweet sensation, part embarrassment and part amused resignation. I later found myself at a stall selling simple trinkets and found that my heart, once hardened into routine, could still be softened by a smile or a light-hearted comment. Those moments, as fleeting as they were, became cherished memories, tiny anchors in the choppy seas of duty and solitude. In each instance, I was reminded that if I were to survive in the medieval times, truly and completely, I would have needed not only an unyielding spirit, but also an uncanny capacity to laugh through the pain. In many ways, my life as an executioner was marked by a daily series of small rituals that in hindsight may have prepared me in small part for the harsh realities of medieval existence, yet ultimately underscored my own inadequacy for such times. There was the morning ritual of tending to the tools of the profession, the careful sharpening of the executioner's knife being the most meditative. I would lay the blade on a flat stone, feeling its cool, unyielding edge as I ran my thumb lightly along its length. The act was both practical and symbolic, a daily testament to the inescapable truth that my life was tethered to the realm of endings rather than beginnings. I took comfort in believing that my small acts of preparation had some measure of control over an otherwise chaotic existence. Even as my mind churned over the inevitable violence of the day ahead, those quiet moments of concentration reminded me that life, with all its unavoidable cruelty, still allowed space for slow, deliberate action and thought. I often found that my thoughts wandered towards the philosophies of justice, pondering ancient ideas of retribution, mercy, and the delicate balance between them. It is, I have always thought, a rather ironic twist that those charged with enforcing the law were often the ones most consumed by questions of moral integrity. Late at night, when the winds moaned softly outside my small lodging, I would sit by a dim oil lamp and consider the countless individuals whose lives had ended at my hands. I would attempt to reconcile the rigid demands of society with the tender remnants of my own humanity, a task that proved to be as impossible as dividing an unyielding rock with a blunt instrument. In those rare introspective hours, even the simplest of observations, a fly buzzing near the flame, the quiet drip of rainwater from a broken gutter, could evoke a profound sense of melancholy and wonder. It was a time when the boundaries between the personal and the professional blurred into a slow, unhurried monologue of grief and quiet resignation. One must not underestimate the effect that the often monotonous climate of medieval England, or wherever these troubled times unfolded, had on one's ability to simply keep on living. I remember, for instance, how the ceaseless pattern of seasons dictated the rhythm of life in ways that often felt as immutable as the laws I was compelled to enforce. Spring arrived with hesitant blossoms and a fleeting burst of color, only for summer to follow with languid heat and an almost oppressive stillness. In the fall, the crisp breezes and the rustle of dying leaves seemed to whisper secrets of mortality, while winter, with its biting frost and prolonged nights, prepared even the hardiest of souls for a protracted winter sleep. In such an environment, any inclination toward subtle humor or the hope for a different kind of existence was quickly smothered by the relentless march of time and tradition. Each season, with its predictable cycles, offered no refuge from the beauties imposed upon an executioner such as myself, no matter how timid my spirit might have been. I often found that my internal calendar, filled with these quiet observations, served as a testament to my belief that survival in the medieval times required not only physical resilience, but a peculiar kind of emotional toughness, attributes I increasingly felt were slipping further from my grasp. And so it is with a slow, reflective cadence that I recount the ordinary events of a life that might appear, on the surface, as if it were dedicated entirely to the grim business of ending lives. Yet, in reality, it was composed of countless subtle instances of introspection, quiet rebellion, and even light-hearted irony. I gave myself to a kind of somnolent routine that was as unremarkable as it was inexorable, finding that the incessant monotony of the days eventually lulled my inner turmoil into a kind of resigned acceptance. There were moments, rare, flickering moments, when I wondered if I might have been better off as a troubadour or a simple craftsman, toiling away at a craft that neither stained one's hands with the blood of others nor haunted one's dreams with the inevitability of mortality. In the long, quiet evenings, spent pondering the major moral dilemmas of a grim trade, I often found that the only solace was to allow myself to sink, deeply and irrevocably, into the mundane details of a life lived in small increments, each one as inevitable as the next. I sometimes imagine that if I were transported unexpectedly into a modern era, a time when the harsh clangor of the executioner's axe is but a distant myth, I might finally find the room to flourish as a simple connoisseur of life's quieter pleasures. Perhaps I would spend my mornings at a cozy cafe, sipping a warm beverage, while reading an old, dog-eared book of poetry. I could see myself walking leisurely through a park, marveling at the orchestrated chaos of autumn leaves swirling about, rather than the somber procession of villagers making their way to a grim fate. In such a modern world, my peculiar blend of thoughtful melancholy and dry humor might even be celebrated as an odd form of artistry, a kind of living testament to the possibility of gentleness, even amid the most challenging circumstances. Yet I know deep in my heart that such dreams, as comforting as they are, remain merely moonlit reflections on a lake of unchangeable fate. In the medieval world, where every day was a sober reminder of life's brevity, my inner desires for softness and artistic whimsy were constantly undermined by the brutal mechanics of duty. I remember one particular afternoon when, after the execution of a man whose crime was as trivial as defiance of a petty local edict, I wandered through the narrow streets with my thoughts in a tangle. The man's final moments had been spent in quiet dignity, his eyes fixed upon nothing but the endless sky, as if he were silently pleading with the heavens for a mercy that was never to come. In the aftermath, I found myself inexplicably moved by the raw vulnerability of the human spirit, a vulnerability that echoed its fragile poetry in the eternal cadence of every life that had succumbed my blade. I returned to my dwelling without fanfare, the images of that quiet resignation playing on an unending loop within my mind. Outside, the town busied itself with the routine tasks of survival, merchants haggling over poorly measured goods, women chatting about the weather and the latest whispered rumors, and children running heedlessly along the muddy streets. Amid these simple, everyday details, I felt a stark contrast between the ordinary pulse of life and the heavy, predetermined rituals that governed the fate of its individuals. The unyielding machinery of medieval justice had little care for the delicate beauty of human frailty, and in that cold indifference, I recognized yet another reason why a sensitive soul, such as mine, would have found it nearly impossible to thrive. Over time, I began to appreciate the stark duality that defined my very existence. While I had been entrusted with the execution of lives deemed unworthy by the laws of a brittle society, I also carried within me a tenderness that made my role all the more contradictory. Each night, as I washed the grime and blood from my hands in the basin of my modest quarters, a basin chipped with age and worn smooth from years of use, I would stare into the mirrored surface and try to reconcile the different parts of my identity. The man in the reflection, with his tired eyes and subtle wrinkles etched from years of quiet sorrow, seemed at odds with the moniker that society had so carelessly assigned him. I could not help but feel that survival in those medieval times demanded not merely the endurance of physical hardship, but also the suppression of even the faintest glimmer of compassion. And in that damp, lonely room, where the only sounds were the faint drip of water and the distant rustle of straw in the wind, I acknowledged a painful truth. If I were truly to survive in such an unforgiving era, I would have had to bury my tender heart beneath layers of practicality and bitter resignation. There were, of course, sporadic moments of levity that served to punctuate the otherwise relentless melancholy of my everyday life. I recall a particular incident involving an overly enthusiastic street performer, a man clad in mismatched garments, juggling crudely fashioned wooden clubs, who decided to set up his act on the very day I was scheduled to perform a particularly gruesome duty. As I passed by his improvised stage on the way to the execution square, he launched into an exuberant display of antics that drew small smiles from a few onlookers. I found it strangely ironic that in a life so occupied by the somber enforcement of law, there existed such displays of unfettered joy and whimsy. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to indulge in a quiet chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Yet, even as I smiled at the transient comedy of it, a profound sense of isolation settled over me. I was the reluctant bystander to an existence filled with precarious beauty, each day marked by the interplay of grim duty and the unpredictable sparkle of human spontaneity. In that moment, I understood that my continued survival rested not only on fulfilling my grim duties, but also on embracing these simple, unscripted expressions of life. As I trace the slow arc of my memories back through the years, I find that my reflections are interwoven with countless instances of the mundane and the unexpected, a tapestry that subtly conveys why a man like me, with his mild humor and delicate sensibility, would have scarcely endured the harshness of medieval society. The gentle cadence of everyday existence, marked by the creaks of wooden doors and the soft murmur of distant voices, became the steady background to my more jarring experiences. And even now, as I reminisce in the quiet twilight of my memory, I am struck by the realization that my struggle was never merely against the external forces of cruelty and brutality. It was a quiet, internal battle, a struggle to preserve the small, tender facets of my identity in a world that demanded relentless severity and unfeeling resolve. In those long, weary days, I often contemplated the curious nature of fate. For a man tasked with the ultimate severance of life, the concept of fate itself carried an odd sense of cosmic humor. I could not help but muse that perhaps fate, in all its inscrutable wisdom, had mistakenly assigned me a role for which I was neither psychologically nor emotionally prepared. Each day, as I carried out my grim tasks with a reluctant precision, I felt that my true self, a being of gentle introspection and muted humor, was slowly being eroded by the very act of marring others' destinies. And so, while the world around me unabashedly celebrated strength and fortitude, I remained the quiet, thoughtful observer, a reluctant executioner whose heart was out of step with the brutal expectations of his time. In many of these recollections, I find that the minutiae of everyday life underscored my growing inability to truly belong in a society that valued steadfast cruelty over tender empathy. I recall a day when, after an especially taxing morning that had left my hands raw and my spirit further frayed, I sought refuge in the simplest of pleasures, the act of repairing a broken piece of village pottery. The craft, though trivial compared to my official responsibilities, allowed me a momentary escape into a realm of quiet creation. I sat by a small sunlit window as I carefully mended the delicate shards with an adhesive thoughtfully prepared by the local apothecary. Each painstaking application of the paste was measured. Each gentle press of a shard into place was a silent ode to a beauty far removed from the lethal precision of my everyday tasks. In that humble act, I rediscovered a spark of hope, a reminder that sometimes survival meant finding the space to be quietly, undeniably human. Even the natural world seemed to offer its own reflections on my predicament. I would often walk the winding country lanes, feeling the solid earth beneath my worn boots, and marvel at the simplicity of the sunrise or the unhurried drift of clouds above. In these moments, the enormity of the world gently enveloped me, and for a heartbeat, all the weight of my duties melted away in the soft golden glow of the morning. A lowly sparrow might flutter nearby, unaware of the poignant conflicts that plagued a man who carried the grim responsibility of meting out death. Nature, so indifferent to the complexities of human endeavor, continued its ceaseless rhythm, a rhythm that in its quiet constancy seemed to mirror my inner desire for a life unburdened by the perpetual cycle of sorrow and severity. I suppose that if I were to evaluate my ability to survive as an executioner in medieval times, I would have to conclude that the minutiae of daily existence, the persistent drizzle of rain on worn cobblestones, the hushed murmurs in a crowded market square, the slow, deliberate repair of humble household objects, each whispered a quiet admonition that I was too delicate, too attuned to the subtle beauties of life, to endure long in such a brutal era. Each act of kindness, each small moment of amusement in the face of adversity, was both a tiny spark of rebellion and a sad testament to my ever-waning spirit. In that relentless cycle, I came to understand that survival meant accepting that one was always on the verge of being engulfed by the very forces one sought to control. Now, as I let these long-ago memories drift by like fragments of a half-remembered dream, I cannot help but see in them not just the pain of loss and duty, but also the undeniable humor woven through the mundane absurdities of my life. Even amid loneliness and the grim routine of executions, there were moments that sparkled with an unexpected levity. The slight smirk of a drunken villager after a poorly executed speech, the absurdity of a weathered sign proclaiming long-forgotten rules, or the gentle chuckle I allowed myself when recalling the oddly specific detail of a poorly mended boot that had set me back a full hour on an otherwise ordinary day. I have come to believe that my fate, in its gentle cruelty, was sealed by the collision of my inner nature and the harsh realities of a time that was as unforgiving as it was unyielding. My meticulous attention to every minute detail, the precise way I arranged my tools, the slow, rhythmic manner in which I prepared for each inevitable act, betrayed a sensitivity that was ill-suited for a life that demanded stark finality. Surviving in the medieval times, as I have slowly come to admit, required more than just the ability to carry out one's duties. It demanded a complete dissolution of one's tender introspection and a ruthless embrace of the moment's macabre necessities. And so, I conclude that my gentle humor, my quiet hope for a less tragic existence, and my sensitivity to the fleeting beauty of small, everyday details, all conspired to ensure that I would not have lasted long in a society that celebrated brutality over compassion. To be an executioner in such a world was to live a life forever at odds with the delicate rhythms of nature, art, and human sentiment. I often imagine that in another time, another life, I might have discovered a path where my soul could have thrived, rather than withered under the relentless pressures of duty and expectation. The long evenings, with the fire's light dancing on the rough-hewn walls of my modest chamber, always brought forth a contemplative silence that allowed me to weigh the gravity of my existence. In that reflective state, I could see the faint outlines of what might have been, a life filled with laughter at a simple joke shared by neighbors, quiet walks through sunlit orchards, and evenings spent in gentle conversation rather than silenced by the weight of inevitable endings. Yet, the convergence of destiny and society had steered me down a path where such dreams were irrevocably out of reach. The inexorable march of time in medieval times showed no mercy to the delicate musings of a sensitive soul, and I, burdened with the stark reality of my role, was left to navigate a world that seemed as indifferent to my hopes as it was to the mournful toll of the great town bell. Looking back, in the slow cadence of memory, I see that my very survival would have required a constant, almost whispered defiance, a quiet perseverance in the face of circumstances that demanded a hardened exterior. The soft sighs of regret as I observed the natural world, the intermittent twinkle of humor found in the mundane, all served as constant reminders that indeed I was an executioner caught between two worlds. One world celebrated the relentless pursuit of order through severity, while the other craved the ineffable warmth of human kindness and modest delight. It is this enduring dissonance that ultimately rendered me a man ill-suited for a time when survival meant not only the physical endurance of hardships, but also the complete suppression of one's inner tenderness. In days that now seem faded into the tapestry of far-off yesteryears, I tried, in my own small way, to balance the grim responsibilities of my trade with a barely concealed longing for something gentler, a desire to be remembered not just as an instrument of death, but as a man with a quietly resolute spirit, whose smile might have, on rare occasions, outshone the melancholy of his station. Such recollections, as unassuming as they may be, carry within them the deep truth that survival demands more than the fulfillment of duty. It requires a reconciliation, however tentative, between one's nature and one's obligations. For me, that reconciliation was perpetually deferred, leaving in its wake a quiet, persistent lament for the gentle soul that could have been preserved in a kinder time. Now, as I gently murmur these words to the quiet night, words that many a gentle spirit might use as lullabies for a weary mind, I find a strange comfort in the slow, measured rhythm of my own recollections. The muted cadence of my own narrative, filled as it is with humble details and soft reflections, stands as a quiet testament to the enduring truth that a life as tender as mine, imbued with small kindnesses and a mild, amused humor, could never have truly survived the relentless, harsh demands of medieval existence. Each detail, the soft clink of a well-worn buckle, the tender hum of a distant lullaby sung by a kindly old woman, the subtle interplay of shadows and light on a rain-worn street, reminds me that there was always a part of me that belonged to a world far gentler than the one I was forced to serve. And so, as centuries have passed, and I recount these memories with a calm, droll tone meant to soothe, as much as to confess, I must accept that my inherent nature, with its gentle humor and appreciation for the minute wonders of everyday life, rendered me chronically out of step with the brutal cadence of medieval times. The life of an executioner, with its unyielding rhythm of endings, left little space for the quiet emergence of beauty in the ordinary. Each day, as I reluctantly donned the dark garments of my calling, I was reminded that survival in that era required a hard-hearted stoicism that I simply could not muster, without sacrificing the very essence of who I was. In the hush of those long nights, when all the raucous clamor of the day had subsided and only the soft whisper of the wind dared to disturb the silence, I would close my eyes and wonder at the delicate irony of fate. There, amidst flickering shadows and the slow, steady ticking of some ancient, unseen clock, I understood deeply that the gentle mercies of life, the light humor, the tender hope for beauty, were luxuries that medieval times left no room for. Perhaps, in another life or under quieter skies, I might have embraced those fleeting moments with all the warmth of a kindly soul. But for me, the unyielding demands of a world governed by severity meant that every gentle impulse was quickly muffled by the burden of duty. Now, as I near the end of this long recollection, a narrative filled with the slow, sleepy details of lives lived in discreet moments and quiet sorrow, I offer these words as both a confession and a lullaby for any troubled soul. I confess that I was an executioner who deep within never truly belonged to the harsh epic that demanded so much sacrifice from its gentle hearts. I offer these reflections, replete with the soft humor and mundane intricacies of everyday life, as a testament to the idea that survival in the medieval times required qualities that, in my case, were as fragile as gossamer threads in a storm. In my own gentle, slightly droll manner, let these words soothe you as they recount a world long gone, a world where even the executioner could not help but dream of a kinder fate. And so I settle into this slow, reflective cadence where the past and the present merge into a lullaby of memories. I remember each creaky door, each whispered goodbye, each tiny, almost imperceptible smile that surfaced amid a day marred by grim necessity. I remember the subtle aroma of